Hello, and welcome to Adult Religion Classes. This is the second half of the Old Testament, and we're on Lesson 5 today. I'm your teacher, Kerry Muhlestein, and today we're going to talk about the downfall of the northern kingdom, or the kingdom of Israel. We'll cover the teachings of the prophet Hosea and a little bit of the teachings of Isaiah. That's a lot to do on one day, a pretty ambitious day. So let's jump into it, and hopefully we can cover this all and get a lot out of it and be edified together. One of the things that we need to do is kind of review a little bit of the history that we covered in the last lesson, just review and then move straight into what's going to happen in what is for today's lesson. If you'll remember right, last time we covered Elisha and a lot of what was happening with the kings of the north and a little bit with the kings of the south, but that story transitions into all of the things that are a pretty big story for today. And so let's just jump in. So last time we were talking about King Jehoshaphat, and he had a long and prosperous reign, and that was great for the kingdom of Judah. But after he dies, his son Jehoram becomes king. And he's pretty wicked. He actually leads Judah into wickedness. That's probably because of his marriage to the daughter of Ahab. So you remember that Ahab in the north, this is the one that had interacted with Elijah so much, and he had married a Phoenician, Jezebel, and they had a daughter named Athaliah. And Athaliah married Jehoram. This Jehoshaphat had his son marry her as part of this alliance that started peace between the two kingdoms. But Athaliah follows really in her mother's footsteps, Jezebel's footsteps. Jezebel was power hungry, you'll remember, and she was really strong in getting people to worship Baal and all these Phoenician gods. And Athaliah seems to have that same influence, the kind of influence that Jezebel had on Ahaz, Athaliah has on Jehoram. And so he begins his rule by killing all of his brothers and anyone else he saw as a threat to his power. And he started to really work hard to help establish the worship of idolatry. Edom revolts during his reign, so Judah had controlled Edom since the days of David, lost it a little bit, regained it, but they revolt and regained their freedom. This is because God isn't helping Judah because they're worshiping idols. Elisha actually writes Jehoram, and he says that he and his kingdom are going to be stricken because of his wickedness. And suddenly the Philistines and the Arabians raid the kingdom, and they're taking spoils from the palace and elsewhere. And then all of Jehoram's sons are killed but one. A guy named Jehoahaz survives. And then Jehoram contracts a disease of the bowels and dies a very painful death. So this doesn't work out well for Jehoram. But his son Jehoahaz does start to rule after him. Now, just to be confusing, Jehoahaz often goes by nicknames, Ahaziah or Azariah. So you'll see all three of those names used for him, and that's sometimes tricky for us, so let's just keep that in mind. Now, let's also keep in mind, not only is he Jehoram's son, but he is Joram's nephew. This is Joram, king of Israel, right? Because of that intermarriage. So he is the son of one king and the nephew of another king, the king of the northern kingdom. And unfortunately, he's guided by his mother, Athaliah, and into more idolatry. And he really moves even further towards idolatry in what we see happening in Judah. So this is a problem for Judah, who have had these two wicked kings in a row, and they're following their kings, as we've talked about before. They just always seem to follow their leaders rather than, you'll get some people, surely, who are choosing to follow God no matter what. But as a whole, the kingdom follows wherever their leaders take them. And we've talked about lessons that we should learn from that, and we'll talk about that more today. The idea of what leaders are you choosing? Who are you giving access to your thoughts and your feelings? Who are you allowing to influence those, and where are you going with that? Now, we do have Jehoahaz and his uncle Joram, king of Israel, allying with each other and going to battle. So they're going to go to battle against Hazael, who is the king of Syria, because he's taken over the northern part of the area across the River Jordan and modern-day Jordan. He's taken that over from Israel, and so as an alliance, they'll go to battle against him. So we're going to have the two kings coming from the palace in Jezreel. This actually is very similar to what happened when you had Jehoshaphat and Ahaz, who met in Jezreel and went to battle over in Gilead, in Ramoth Gilead, which is the high place of Gilead. We're going to have the same thing happen here with their descendants. They'll launch and they'll go over to Ramoth Gilead to go to battle. And while they're there in battle, Joram is wounded, and they both return to Jezreel, where Joram is healed. But then Elisha will send one of the sons of the prophets, this is one of his followers, over to Jehu, who is the general for the northern kingdom, and he is still in battle here at Ramoth Gilead. So here are some pictures of that area so you can get an idea. It's in the modern-day Ajloon area of Jordan. Ramoth means a high place. It's the highest places in the Gilead area. So this is the area where they're at. And Jehu had been anointed, if you remember right, earlier to become king in Israel at some point. So now Elisha sends a representative to remind Jehu, you've been anointed to become king and to cleanse this wickedness out of the northern kingdom. So Jehu, who is over in this area, there's a nice picture you can see of that larger hilly area. He's over in this area, is going to ride back to Jezreel. And so here is a view from Jezreel looking over across. You can see where it goes, the hills, and then it goes way down and comes back up. Let's see if I can point that out. So hills, you can see that it gets lower right around here, and then you've got hills over here on this side. So that's looking across to that's looking across to across the Jordan River and over to Ramoth Gilead. So Jehu comes riding back to Jezreel with the intent to get rid of this wicked dynasty that was started by Omri and is continuing on. So here you see some of the ruins of Jezreel. This is the first picture. If you were to turn around and look at the other way, you'd see some of these ruins. There's not much left, but you can see some of the stones that made the palace wall. So here you are from kind of the palace area, again, looking down into that valley that Jehu comes running up. And this is an interesting story in that I love that they say as the kings are watching and they see someone coming in a chariot, someone says, I think it's Jehu. He drives furiously. So he's just a crazy chariot driver, right? And he's just coming so fast. They're like, yeah, only Jehu can come like that. And they're worried what's going on. He's the general. Is he coming to give us good tidings? Is he coming with some kind of problem? What's going on? So they're saying, in the King James Version, it says, is it peace, Jehu? But really, they're saying, shalom, Jehu. Is it shalom, right? Is it peace? But also, are things going well? Are you coming to talk to me nicely? What are the tidings? And Jehu just comes riding up and kills them. He slays both kings. One of them flees and gets a long ways before he kills him, but he kills those kings, and then he comes back to kill Jezebel, who's been kind of the instigator of all of this wickedness in both kingdoms at this point. And as she's looking out the window, and someone throws her out the window. The technical term for this is defenestration. You can use that word to impress your friends, but she's thrown out the window and dies. And when he comes back out, he finds that the dogs have been eating her and licking up her blood, which fulfills the prophecies that have been made by both Elijah and Elisha. So now Jehu is going to be the king, and here you can see some of that palace area where that happened. He's the new king of Israel. So this is a map actually that shows you what happens in the battle with Deborah and Barak, but I'm using it so that you can see the kind of close mirror as Jehu chases the kings of Israel and kills them, and it ends up being in the same places that we've seen earlier battles happen, and the same things kind of happen. So that's worth our knowing. So after Elisha has sent to Jehu, and we have Jehu with this coup, and he takes over Israel, Jehu will be the second dynasty that lasts in Israel. In all the kings of Israel, there are only two successful dynasties, meaning that most of the time when a son succeeds his father, that son is killed very soon, assassinated or something like that, and you don't have the dynasty continue. There are two sets. One started by Omri, where he has son, grandson, great-grandson, and so on that succeed him, and then Jehu will have that same thing. So you get a few times where you get father succeeding son successfully, and then that stops. So Jehu will now reign in Israel, And he has a fairly violent reign to begin with. As I said, he does all of this killing to get rid of the wickedness. And I think that that's what he was supposed to do. I don't know, but that's my assumption. He's supposed to get rid of all those who have been causing so much wickedness in both kingdoms and wreaked so much spiritual and physical havoc with everyone and been murdering people and so on and so on. A lot of murdering has been going on. He does that. He kills the priests of Baal that have been forcing people to worship Baal and have been killing other people and so on. And so he starts out well, but he just kind of, well, or at least fairly well, but violently. But that violence seems to take hold of him, and he just he's fairly violent and goes too far. Kills too many people. He's largely faithful to Jehovah, but he doesn't get rid of those idols that have been set up by Jeroboam II, as no kings of the northern kingdom will. So he helps correct the path, but he does so with problems, and he goes too far. This is power going to his head, as it were. So once he's killed both of these kings and he's reigning in Israel, well, the king of Judah has also been killed, and his mother, Athaliah, takes matters into her own hands. She kills everyone who could ascend to the throne as a relative of Joram, and she reigns. She becomes queen, and she reigns in her stead. Or at least she thinks she has killed everyone. But there's actually a boy named Joash. He's a royal heir, a son, who had been with a priest named Jehoiada. And Jehoiada is in the temple, and he hides Joash and raises him in the temple, and Athaliah doesn't know. So she has a number of years where she reigns in wickedness, and then when Joash reaches the age of 7, Jehoiada brings him out in the temple publicly and crowns him king immediately before anyone can do anything, and then they send and have Athaliah killed, and so Joash will reign in Judah. Now, Joash starts out as a very righteous king. He works with Jehoiada. Jehoiada is really the power behind the throne for quite a while. Jehoiada is the high priest, so he is helping Joash bring back righteousness and get rid of idolatry and worshiping Jehovah, and they're doing things pretty well. But when Jehoiada dies, Joash turns to idolatry, and so he ends up being righteous to begin with, but then leading them into wickedness. And that ends up being a problem for Judah that just keeps yo-yoing back and forth between righteousness and wickedness. All right. As a result of when Joash, so we have years they prosper because they're righteous, but then as a result of Joash turning to wickedness, then God also doesn't help them and things go wrong. So it tells us that God sells Judah into the hand of her enemies. Hazael, who's king in Syria, will conquer towns in Judah such as Gath, and he even goes against Jerusalem and defeats Judah there, even though his army is much smaller. His army is smaller than the Judahite or Jewish army, so we should talk about that term. Judahite means you're a member of the kingdom of Judah. We will later use that to mean Jewish. Once the northern kingdom is gone, that's kind of the phrase that we start to use there. But Judahite is really what it is. So it's less about what tribe you're from and more about what kingdom you're from, the term Judahite or Jew. So in any case, even though the Judahite army is larger, the Syrians defeat them because God is not with them. Joash has to send Hazael, king of Syria, a gift of a lot of wealth, and he goes back to Syria, and he's left wounded or diseased, and then he's slain by his own people. And his son Amaziah becomes the king instead. Now, it's worth noting as we kind of go back and forth between the two kingdoms that while Joash was alive and reigning, Jehu, king of Israel, dies, and his son Jehoahaz becomes king after him. Jehoahaz is largely righteous, but he still doesn't get rid of the idols or the golden calves that have been set up in the north and south in Israel, what is called the sins of Jeroboam. He doesn't stop that, but he largely is righteous. So they're oppressed by Syria, but for a time, because they're being largely righteous, Jehoahaz and Israel are delivered from Syria for a time. But then Jehoahaz dies, and his son, Jehoash, who is also referred to as Joash. And so you have a lot of people with the same names you'll see going on. These family names keep getting circulated through, and it can get a little bit confusing. But Joash will reign after him. And he also is largely righteous, but continues in the traditions of Jeroboam I with those idols in the north and in the south. But as Elisha is getting very, very sick, Joash actually comes and has a tender little visit with Elisha and expresses confidence in him and gratitude for him. And Elisha prophesies that Joash will have some success over Syria. And so that will happen. In the meantime, Amaziah ascends to the throne in Judah, as we've spoken of earlier. And he follows the Lord. He intends to regain Edom as a vassal, and he gathers a large army from his kingdom, and then he pays for a lot of Israelites, so people from the kingdom of Israel, to be mercenaries, to be part of his army. But he's told by a prophet that God doesn't want men from Israel in his army, so even though he's already paid them, he listens to God, and he sends them home, tells them not to come and fight, and then he trusts in God that God will do the fighting rather than mercenaries. And God does so, and despite their small number, they conquer Edom again. So they bring Edom back under their control. Unfortunately, when he brings home the spoils of Edom, he brings home some of their idols, and then pretty soon he starts to worship these Edomite gods, and so he turns to idolatry. After trusting in God and being blessed by God, he turns to idolatry. This is a sad story we see happening so often. You can call it the pride cycle, the idolatry cycle, the righteousness cycle, the covenant cycle, whatever you'd like to call it, that this happens so often. And as a result, God doesn't protect them, and those mercenaries that he'd paid decide, well, we'd like to fight somewhere and get spoils. So they got their payment, but they didn't get the spoils of war, that when they take over a town, they can bring some of the stuff home with them, and they'd like that. So they actually go and fight against Israel and bring home spoils. I mean, they fight against Judah, and they bring home spoils from Judah. And that seems to be because we've turned to idolatry in Judah at this point. In any case, Amaziah is upset that these mercenaries have come to have a battle with them, and he wants to go to battle against the kingdom of Israel to regain some of his losses. And that's not a good idea because the kingdom of Israel is so much larger. So Joash, king of Israel, he tries to dissuade him. They're related now, getting further and further distantly related, but still they're related. They've been allies. He says, you don't want to do this. Let's not do this. Let's stay friends. You do not want to attack me. Amaziah doesn't listen. He attacks, and he is defeated fairly soundly. Jerusalem is pillaged by the armies of the kingdom of Israel. So it's not very long after that Joash dies, and Jeroboam, so that's the king of Israel, and Jeroboam II becomes the king. So this will be one of the longer lasting kings, and you can see how we just kind of keep trading back and forth in the stories about these kingdoms because they're coexisting, but their rulers don't line up perfectly, right? So Jeroboam II becomes king and will reign for a very long time. Amaziah is actually killed. He will be succeeded by his son Azariah, who's also known as Uzziah. All right? And now Uzziah and Jeroboam II largely overlap in their reigns, and they are two of the longest reigning kings and two of the most prosperous kings. Both of them regain territory that had been lost by their kingdoms. Both of them expand their commerce and trade. These are two very, very long and very, very prosperous reigns. Now, we spoke about that a little bit when we did Amos, because we said, and you'll remember we put up this chart so you could kind of see the different historical readings in 2 Kings that overlap with the different readings, or the prophets and the prophecies of prophets. So remember that Amos prophesied towards the end of the reigns of Uzziah and Jeroboam II, and he's warning people bad things are coming, and they all think, why? Everything is so wonderful. But it's because they start to turn to idolatry, and so he sees what's coming, and he warns them, but they don't listen because, well, they not only turn to idolatry, but remember they're oppressing the poor. In the midst of their prosperity, they've become so focused on that they're not taking care of the poor. Instead, they're taking advantage of the poor. And so Amos warned them of that, and you can remember that from our last lesson. So, overlapping with Amos towards the end of Amos's reign, and overlapping with Isaiah, he'll be at the beginning of Isaiah's reign. He's kind of the bridge in between, is Hosea. So let's talk about the prophet Hosea and what Hosea will teach and do. All right, so Hosea, we're also going to talk about his wife Gomer. This is one of the more interesting books in the Old Testament. It's sometimes hard for people to understand or to swallow, but I think actually explains the message of the prophets and the way God works with all of his people in the Old Testament. This book, I think, explains the Old Testament better than just about any other book. It's really important. So let's first of all understand that Hosea is a prophet from the north. We hear in 1st and 2nd Kings a number of things about prophets from the north, prophesying and teaching. Elijah and Elisha are both from the north. But this is our writer from the north. All of the other writers, we have Amos, Isaiah, Micah, and so on. They're all from the south. This is the only writings we have from a prophet from the north. That's probably because the record we have, the Bible, the Old Testament, is actually the record of the southern kingdom. We don't have the record of the northern kingdom. There were probably other prophets that prophesied in the northern kingdom, but their records were kept by northern kingdom writers and record keepers, and we never ended up with that. In fact, I would guess that the brass plates that Lehi ends up with, and remember Lehi is from the tribe of Manasseh, so he's from a northern kingdom tribe, I would guess that they had those records, and that's why we have prophets like Zenock and Zenos and so on. They're probably northern kingdom prophets that their records were kept by the north, and once the northern tribes are carried away, they're lost to us. I don't know why we're fortunate enough that Hosea's record was preserved by these southern writers, but I'm grateful for that. Now let's talk about Hosea's marriage, and if we're going to understand Hosea and the book of Hosea, we have to understand two things. First is Hosea's marriage. Some will argue that this is a symbolic marriage only, that it didn't really happen, and some will argue that it really happened and carries symbolism. I don't know. We can't tell which is the case, but I do know that typically in the Old Testament, symbolic actions really happen that carry their symbolic message all the more powerfully because they're happening. So I lean towards thinking that the marriage and their children are real, but I don't know for sure. What happens is Hosea is told to go and find someone who is a harlot. Now, she's not a harlot by choice. She's a slave, and she's been forced into being a harlot. And he will buy her freedom. He will redeem her, buy her freedom, and marry her. And it seems weird to us that a prophet would marry a harlot, but when you think of him redeeming her and marrying her, that's actually a pretty powerful message. That's what God is willing to do for all of us. Redeem us from the slavery that we've been sold into by ourselves or by others. Redeem us from that and be in an intimate relationship with us, a loving, kind, wonderful relationship with us. So let's keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that marriage and the children they have in just a minute. But let's also look at the concept of chesed. So if you were with us when we talked about the Abrahamic covenant in the first part of the Old Testament, you'd be familiar with this term by now. We've mentioned it a few times, but chesed is a very, very important term. It is a special kind of love and mercy available within a covenant context. All right, so that's the general concept of chesed, that there is a special kind of love and mercy available for those who have made a covenant relationship. Just like in marriage, there is a special kind of love and mercy because of the covenant relationship and just that relationship you formed. That's true in the covenant with God as well. So let's look at a couple of examples of chesed in the book of Hosea, and then we can just look at the book of Hosea in general, but we want to understand it better because of these concepts. So let's go to Hosea chapter 2, verse 19. Okay, Hosea chapter 2, verse 19. Hosea says, "And I will betroth thee unto me forever. Yea, I will betroth thee unto me in righteousness and in judgment and in loving kindness and in mercies." So the word loving kindness there is the chesed word. So this is talking about Hosea and his marriage to Gomer, but it's also a symbol of God talking about his covenant relationship with Israel. And note what he says, and we want to make sure we understand this correctly. Let's also remember that judgment is, we understand that incorrectly most of the time. Judgment means making things right, making things the way they should be. It includes an element of taking care of those who can't take care of themselves, but it's just making everything right, okay? And righteousness is similar. It's frequently tied with judgment, and it's the idea of becoming a little bit more godly and also just becoming right, becoming the way we should be. So let's read this verse again. I will betroth thee. In other words, I will make a covenant. So Hosea will betroth Gomer in this way. God will make a covenant with Israel at the time, and you as an Israelite individual in this way. I will betroth thee unto me forever, right? This is eternity. I will betroth thee unto me in righteousness and in judgment. I'm going to make things right. I'm going to take care of you and make things the way they should be. And in loving kindness, in chesed, in this special kind of love and mercy that is a higher love and a higher mercy that President Nelson has taught us, gives us greater access to the atoning power of Christ, and in mercies. That's beautiful, isn't it? That's the concept that's being taught in Hosea, all right? So let's make sure we understand that. Let's also look at chapter 3, verses 2 through 3, so that we can just kind of make sure we understand this concept. This is when Hosea, well, let's start in verse 1. Chapter 3, verse 1. Then the Lord said unto me, Go, yet love a woman, beloved of her friend, yet an adulteress, according to the love of the Lord toward the children of Israel, who look to other gods and love flagons of wine. So he's saying, I'm going to have you marry someone who is in bondage and a harlot in the same way that Israel has sold themselves into bondage to idolatry and drunkenness, right? So rather than being faithful to me. So look, verse 2. So I bought her to me for 15 pieces of silver. This is where we figure out that she was a slave. And that's probably why she's a harlot, right? I'm sure it is. So I bought her unto me for 15 pieces of silver and for a homer of barley and half a homer of barley. So she's expensive. But he buys her, and I said unto her, Thou shalt abide for me many days, thou shalt not play the harlot, and thou shalt not be for another man, so will I also be for thee. So this doesn't use the word chesed, but you see the concept is plain here. This woman, who is a covenant Israelite, has been sold into bondage, but she can always be bought back because of that loving kindness. She can be redeemed and be made whole and free and made right in judgment and in loving kindness and in mercies and so on, right? That's the concept. Let's look at one more. Hosea chapter 6, verses 1 through 6. This is what Israel will say to Hosea or to the Lord eventually. Come and let us return unto the Lord, for he hath torn, and he will heal us. He hath smitten, and he will bind us. Keep all this in mind. We're going to come back to that. After 2 days he will revive us. In the third day he will raise us up, and we shall live in his sight. Then shall we know, if we follow on to know the Lord, his going forth is prepared as in the morning, and he shall come unto us as the rain. And the rain's a good thing. It's what gives you life. Latter and former rain unto the earth. O Ephraim, what shall I do? This is God now speaking. O Ephraim, what shall I do unto thee? O Judah, what shall I do unto thee? So Hosea preaches to both the north and the south. He is one of these prophets, and I should say this, that we see that slew of prophets in that chart, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah. These are prophets who are trying to save the northern kingdom, trying to warn the northern kingdom, repent so you don't have to be destroyed. That God does that all the time. When destruction is nearing because wickedness is getting so bad, he always sends a great number of prophets to warn and to try to get the people to repent. So here is Hosea doing that. O Ephraim, what shall I do unto thee? O Judah, what shall I do unto thee? For your goodness is as a morning cloud, which means it's there for a little while and then it's gone. And as the early dew it goeth away, right? Dew that's on the leaf in the morning, and then as soon as the sun hits, it's gone. That's what, and we've seen that. They keep returning to righteousness, and then boom, they're right back to wickedness. Now look at verse 6. For I desired mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. So again, this isn't chesed, but this is God pleading with them because of his chesed and saying, I wanted you to be merciful to each other rather than that oppression that we saw Amos talking about. I wanted you to be merciful to each other. That was more important to me than all of your sacrifices. And I wanted you to know me. That's more important to me than all your sacrifices. In other words, love God and love each other. That's what he wanted more than anything else. And he's pleading with them and working with them because he has this chesed for them. So he's betrothed to them. So he's going to keep working with them and trying to help them. So let's look at Hosea chapter 1 and the story of Hosea and Gomer. We're going to look at 1 and 2 and a number of others, and the naming of his children and so on. And we have to think of the marriage symbolism, because remember, it's a symbol that teaches us about Israel's relationship with God, ours as Israelite individuals, Israel as a whole, and ancient Israel's in Hosea's day. So we get in chapter 1, we have the story. So it's told in a couple places. We already read where in chapter 3, where he goes and buys her, but that's the second time he tells that story, and we get the details about the buying, or redeeming, setting her free. He's not really buying her, he's setting her free. But we get in verse 2, Hosea chapter 1, verse 2, the beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea, and the Lord said to Hosea, go, take unto thee a wife of whoredoms, and children of whoredoms. So this is when he's told to go marry Gomer. For the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord. So he's saying, you're going to marry a whore just like I am now currently married to Israel, who is not faithful to me. And so verse 3, and he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, which conceived and bare him a son. And the Lord said unto him, call his name Jezreel for yet a little while, and I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu, and will cause to cease the kingdom of the house of Israel. So the first child is named Jezreel because of all that bloodshed that happened in Jezreel when Jehu went in, and not only got rid of the wicked kings and Jezebel and the priests of Baal, but then started killing all sorts of people to cement his power. So that he's saying, this is a prophecy. What happened in Jezreel is going to come back and be visited upon Jehu's kingdom, and destruction is going to come. Let's go to verse 6. And she conceived again and bare a daughter, and God said unto him, call her name Lo Ruhamah, which literally, Lo is the word no, and Ruhamah is mercy. Literally, it means no mercy. And this is a prophecy, for I will no more have mercy upon the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. Do you see what he's saying? So these children are named to tell Israel what is coming. And he's saying, you're past the point of my being able to spare you. So chesed never ends. But ruhamah, mercy, can end, meaning that at some point God has to say, I'm not giving you second chances. The punishment is here. Then he will try again because of his chesed, and we'll come back to that, all right? Verse 7, but I will have mercy upon the house of Judah, and will save them by the Lord their God, and will not save them by bow, nor by sword, nor by battle, by horse, nor by horsemen. So we'll come back to that later. Now we're going to get verse 8. Now when she had weaned Lo Ruhamah, she conceived and bare a son. Then said God, call his name Lo Ami. Lo means no, and Am is people, and E means mine. So literally, this is not my people. And then it says, for ye are not my people, and I will not be your God. Now, if you've, again, followed our teachings about the covenant through these two different courses, you'll know that the primary phrase for saying that the covenant is happening is that Israel is God's people and he is their God. So when God says, you are not my people and I am not your God, what he is saying is, you've broken the covenant and all the covenant blessings are over. Now, not really, because chesed never ends. So he's going to give them a chance. Keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that. I hope that I'm never in the position where God says to me, Lo Ami, you are not my person. Now, I will always have that chance to come back because of chesed, so we're getting there. But it does mean that the covenant blessings have ended, and now the covenant cursings or the covenant reversals, the covenant humbling is maybe the best way to say it. The covenant humbling is happening, and you are going to be humbled. All right? That's exactly what God will teach us as we go through the rest of this book of Hosea, all right? So, we're going to go to chapter 2. Say ye to your brethren, Ami, and to your sisters, Ruhamah. So that's saying, my people, and mercy. Plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, neither am I her husband. Let her therefore put away her whoredoms out of her sight, and her adulteries from between her breasts. So what had happened was that Gomer, after bearing 3 children, being married for a while to Hosea, and bearing 3 children to him, decided she liked the payments she was getting as a whore, even though she was a slave and probably wasn't getting most of them, she was getting some things. She liked those, and she went back to being a harlot. She left him and went back to being a harlot. And this is symbolic of what Israel keeps doing with God, right? And the dissolution of the marriage although it's not fully dissolved, but she does leave him. That's some powerful symbolism, and I think we should ask ourselves, how do we play harlots? How do we, after being in a covenant relationship with God and being faithful to Him, then stop being faithful? Maybe we're partially faithful and partially not. We're still with them, but we're also worshiping other gods, and we all do this. We have to figure out, how are we worshiping, and we talked about this in earlier lessons, especially about Elijah. How are we worshiping both Jehovah and the world at the same time? We all do it, all right? So I think we should also ask ourselves, what do we learn from the purchasing of Gomer? What do we learn from the idea that even though she had sold herself into slavery, Hosea, meaning also symbolic for God, but Hosea will buy her back, and he will bring her back again. He accepts her back. But it happens after some interesting things. Let's go, we're going to go to verse 5 of chapter 2. For their mother hath played the harlot, she that conceived them hath done shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers that gave me bread, and my water, and my wool, and my flax, mine oil, and my drink. See, this is why she went to play the harlot again. Verse 6, Therefore, behold, I will hedge up thy way with thorns, and make a wall, that she shall not find her paths. And she shall follow after her lovers, but she shall not overtake them. And she shall seek them, but shall not find them. Then shall she say, I will go and return to my first husband, for then was it better with me than now. For she did not know that I gave her corn and wine and oil, and multiplied her silver and gold, which they prepared for Baal. So, verse 9, Therefore will I return and take away my corn in the time thereof, and my wine in the season thereof, and I will recover my wool and my flax to cover her nakedness. And I will discover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and I will cause all her mirth to cease. So think of what he is saying. He's saying to Hosea about Gomer, but as I talk about Gomer, hear what he's saying he will do to Israel. In his day, in our day, Israel as a whole, Israelite individuals. He says, I know she left you because she wanted certain things. She didn't realize how much you were blessing her and taking care of her, and so she wanted those things, and so she's left you. So here's what we'll do. We'll make it so she can't get those things. And we'll make it so that even when she does, she's not happy. We will take away the joy that she gets, or it's not really joy, the fleeting excitement that she gets from those things, and bring her misery, and then she'll remember how much you took care of her, and she'll come back to you, and you can bless her and take care of her and make things good for her. That's what happens. Things don't go well for Gomer. She comes back to Hosea, and that's what God is doing for Israel in this time period. He's warning them, I'm about to humble you. You are going to be scattered and destroyed. I'm about to humble you. And we've seen that happen so many times. We'll see it continue to happen. It will happen with Judah. It happens with all of us. He says, I will humble you, but it's only so that you will come back to me. And then he will have chesed on them. Then he will have wonderful and beautiful things happen. So we've read all of these things. We haven't read 14 through 16. Let's read this. Chapter 2, verse 14 through 16. Therefore, behold, I will allure her, and bring her into the wilderness, and speak comfortably unto her. And I will give her vineyards from thence, and the valley of Achor for a door of hope, and she shall sing there, as in the days of her youth, as in the days when she came up out of the land of Egypt. So now he's clearly making that comparison with Israel, right? And he's saying, though I have humbled Gomer and Israel, I will then coax Israel or Gomer back to Hosea, Israel back to God. The humbling is followed by the coaxing, by the chesed. God will not stop because of his chesed. So that eventually, and we won't read all of these things, but there are plenty of wonderful verses to read in here. We're just going to skip to chapter 14, which is at the very end of Hosea. And as we skip to chapter 14, we're going to see how this story ends, and this is how it always ends. Chapter 14, verses 4 through 8. I will heal their backsliding. So now this is God. He's used Hosea and Gomer as a symbol to teach us, but now he's talking pretty specifically about Israel in their day, in the future, in our day, and in all days. I will heal their backsliding. I will love them freely, for mine anger is turned away from him. I will be as the dew unto Israel, and he shall grow as the lily, and cast forth his roots as Lebanon. His branches shall spread, and his beauty shall be as the olive tree, and his smell as Lebanon. They that dwell under his shadow shall return. They shall revive as the corn and grow as the vine. The scent thereof shall be as the wine of Lebanon. Do you see all the images he's using to say, I will bring you back and make everything wonderful? And this is what will happen. Verse 8. Ephraim shall say, what have I to do any more with idols? I have heard him and observed him. I am like a green fir tree. From me is thy fruit found. But do you see what's happened? After humbling them and then giving them another chance because of that chesed and coaxing them and bringing back, finally Israel says, I'm done with idols. And they'll be blessed and receive all the blessings of the Lord. This is the story of the Old Testament. We've seen it happen a number of times already, where they're wicked and they're humbled and then they come back to God. We're about to see it in a very long cycle where they're scattered, and it's going to be a 2,500-year process to bring them back to where they say, I'm done with idols. However long it takes, whatever has to happen, because of God's chesed, his love and mercy for us, he will never stop working with Israel. Not Israel as a whole, not you as an Israelite individual. He will do whatever it takes, the easy way, the hard way, whichever way we choose. He will do whatever it takes to bring us back to him. We're seeing it happen in our day as Israel is gathered, and hopefully you see it happen in your own life. So I think that this book of Hosea really does help us understand the history of Israel in the Old Testament. I hope you see what it tells us about God and Israel and God and us and our relationship with God and that covenant. This is important, important stuff. All right? So now back to the storyline. It's important to understand that God is sending these prophets to try and get Israel and Judah to repent before destruction comes. That's happening in the midst of all of these other stories that we're reading, right? It's important to read these teachings of the prophets in the midst of that so that we know what's happening. In the meantime, Uzziah, who's been so righteous, eventually struggles a little bit. He tries to take some things upon himself he shouldn't. He's smitten with leprosy. He has to leave the city. He builds another palace. We've found that archaeologically, so it seems that he reigns from a different palace and so on. But he comes back and still remains faithful to God. Now we're going to move on to talking about the fall of Israel. And this is going to be a pretty ugly story, actually, all right? So we get a guy named Zechariah who becomes king. He's the son of Jeroboam II. He succeeds his father Jeroboam II, but he's assassinated after 6 months. He does not last very long. He's assassinated by a guy named Shallum who takes the throne, but then he dies after 1 month. All right, so now we get into that. The two kind of stable dynasties are gone, and now we get into that totally erratic, unstable period. So after Shallum, he dies, and then a guy named Menachem becomes king, and he takes really vicious action to keep the throne, kills lots of people and all sorts of things to try and keep the throne. He loses a lot of land to Syria, and eventually will start paying tribute to Tiglath-Pileser III, called Pul in the Bible, P-U-L, but he's an Assyrian king named Tiglath-Pileser III. So that makes it so that we want to understand some of the geopolitics that are going on here. Assyria, what you can see is over here, modern-day Iraq. It's in what's called Mesopotamia, between these two rivers, between and Potamia rivers. So Assyria has been growing and becoming a huge empire. They've taken over down here what would be called Babylon, and they're expanding this way. And as a result, both Syria and Israel, knowing that if they don't, they will be destroyed and conquered by Assyria. And this gets confusing because we've got Assyria and Syria that we're going to talk about quite a bit. So listen for whether it has an on the beginning or not. But Syria and Israel start paying tribute to Assyria. And they do this because they know they have to. They do it voluntarily. They haven't been conquered yet. They just do it to avoid being conquered, all right? So with all of that in mind, we then get a guy named who succeeds his father. Pekahiah succeeds his father, and he doesn't last long. He's killed by someone named Pekah, which is probably short for Pekahiah. They probably have the same name. But anyway, we don't learn that in the Bible for sure, so we don't know. So Pekah is the one who has assassinated Pekahiah, and then this assassination seems to be supported by Rezin, who is king of Syria. So these two have decided we don't want to be vassals or paying tribute to Assyria, but Pekahiah was willing to keep paying the tribute. These guys don't want that to happen, so they kill the king of Israel, who has been paying the tribute, and they want to form an alliance that will make it so that they don't pay that tribute. In the meantime, King Uzziah dies, and his son Ahaz takes the throne. Now, Pekah and Rezin try to force Judah to join their anti-Assyrian campaign. So their idea is, Syria says, I can't resist Assyria on my own. If I'm going to resist them, I need allies. So they get Israel to fall in. And Israel's saying, I can't resist on my own, but maybe with allies I can. So they form an alliance, but they feel like just the two of us together aren't going to be able to resist Assyria. We need to get someone else. Well, the next biggest neighbor next door is Judah. So they want to force Ahaz to join them in their rebellion against Assyria. Now, Judah's not yet a vassal of Assyria, but they know one day Assyria will come, and they will be. So they're trying to force them. Ahaz isn't so sure this is a good idea, and we're going to spend a bit of time talking about this. He's not so sure it's a good idea. So they are trying to force him to join them in their alliance. In the meantime, when Tiglath-Pileser III has people elsewhere in his empire rebelling against him, and he's off battling them, they rebel. And the form of rebellion is to say, we're not sending tribute anymore. So let's talk about the tribute. The tribute is lots of wealth in terms of, I mean, they don't really have currency in the day, but gold and silver, but also grain and fruit and all those kinds of things, but also a tribute of people. Sons and daughters are sent to be servants and serve in the military. And that last part will become the most burdensome. It's all burdensome, but that last part becomes the most burdensome, all right? Now, they had been counting on Egypt for help as well. Egypt had told them, if you rebel, then we'll help you. That's because Egypt wants to keep this buffer zone between them and Assyria. But Egypt falls through. They don't end up helping them. So let's dive into this story. We really want to understand this story, and also the prophecies about this story will help us with a number of things, all right? So let's dive into this and make sure we understand. This is called the Syro-Ephraimite War, because Syria and Israel, led by the tribe of Ephraim, will go to war against Judah. All right, so we're going to dive into that story, and so let's look at this. We're going to look at kind of a timeline here that helps us see the kings of Assyria, the kings of Israel, prophets that are prophesying, and the kings of Judah, all right? So you can see here, Amos, I don't know if he overlaps with Isaiah, but he certainly overlaps with Hosea. Hosea overlaps with the prophecy of Isaiah, and Micah overlaps as well. Isaiah prophesies for a very, very long time. And Isaiah starts in the last years of Uzziah, and this is going to put him here in this crazy period between Menachem and Pekah, but really his ministry gets going during the days of Pekah, all right? And that's when Tiglath-Pileser III is the emperor in Assyria that is putting all this pressure on these people. So Isaiah is going to be very much a part of dealing with Ahaz and that Syro-Ephraimite war, and we're going to read some prophecies about that are very important prophecies. So let's talk about Isaiah in general, just to get a feel for Isaiah and what we know about him. Isaiah, his name, Yeshayahu, means Jehovah saves. It's theophoric. It has Jehovah in his name, and it's Jehovah saves, and we're going to find how prophetic that name is. He lives in Judah, but he prophesies to Israel and really to all nations. There's a big section of his book where he's prophesying to Assyria, Babylon, the Philistines, the Edomites, the Arabs, the Syrians. He prophesies Moab. He prophesies to everyone. All right. So he is born around 770 BC. We don't know exactly when. Receives his call around 740 BC. I think actually before that. My guess is he's actually in his early 20s when he receives his call. And tradition has that he dies around 690 BC, that he's son and half by Hezekiah's son Manasseh. We don't really know that for sure, all right? He serves under King Uzziah and Jotham and Ahaz and Hezekiah and Manasseh. So he serves during a lot of kings of Judah, all right? Tradition holds that he's Hezekiah's father-in-law and the cousin to Uzziah. We don't know that. We just really can't know, but that's a tradition. He is clearly very highly educated, and he's an aristocrat. He's not like Amos, who was a farmer. He is in the court. He's incredibly articulate. He may be the best writer in the history of the world. He is certainly in up there in the top group. And so he's different than a number of different, or a number of prophets who come from different parts of society. There are a couple of dates that if you just know these dates, they will be helpful for you. Of course, there's no quiz to pass this course or something like that. These are dates I require my students to know just because as we go through and talk about Isaiah and different things, it just makes a big difference to know these dates. This first one, as I said, is pretty questionable. I don't know for sure if it's 740, but somewhere around there. We know 740 is Uzziah's death. Well, somewhere around there, and Isaiah's call. 735 is the Syro-Ephraimite war that we're about to talk about. Then we get 732, which is when the northern tribes are going to start to be scattered. 721 is the real scattering of Israel. And then 701 is when Assyria is going to come into Judah, all right? So we need to know all of those things. We're going to cover this history more in a moment, but it's helpful for you to get this overview, all right? So we're going to have the Syro-Ephraimite war trying to resist Assyria. Then we're going to have Assyria coming in and conquering in 732, and then coming in and destroying in 721, and then coming in and destroying most of Judah in 701. All right, so Assyria just keeps coming further and further and further in. So now let's talk about the Syro-Ephraimite war and see if we can figure out what that is. As we've already said, this is because Syria and Israel are trying to force Judah to join them in an alliance against Assyria. Judah doesn't want to join, so they actually do come to battle against them, and they will carry a number of people from Judah into both Syria and Israel. They're successful in many ways in conquering them, but not in getting them to join the alliance. They don't fully conquer them. And the people in Israel aren't so excited about having taken their Judahite cousins captives of war, so they're kind of forced to let at least Syria. Syria keeps theirs, but Israel lets those Judahites that had been captured go back. Now, to understand this, you're going to have to see that Isaiah uses lots of different terms to refer to these groups. So let's look at who we have here. We have Syria, and there are three kings, right? We have Syria, Israel, and Judah, so the king of Syria, Israel, and Judah. So when God talks about Judah, he will refer to Judah by saying King Ahaz, sometimes he'll say Jerusalem, or House of David. All of those are ways of referring to Judah and her rulers. He'll do the same thing with Syria. He'll refer to Syria as King Rezin, or Aram, that's the Hebrew word for Syria, or Damascus, their capital. All right? And with Israel, he does the same thing. He'll call him King Pekah, or he'll call him the son of Remaliah. That's also who his father is, right? So Pekah, son of Remaliah, also refer to it as Ephraim or Samaria, which is their capital. So you have to keep these things in mind because Isaiah will use all of those terms to refer to these different places. So just know, if it talks about Ephraim, he's talking about the kingdom of Israel. If he says Samaria, he's talking about the kingdom of Israel. If he's talking about son of Remaliah, he's talking about the kingdom of Israel and their king. Or Pekah, he's talking about the kingdom of Israel and their king, and so on with all of these. Knowing those phrases will really make this useful and helpful for you. Now, this Syro-Ephraimite war is when Syria and Israel go to war against Judah, as we've said. And the problem is that Ahaz is put in a very, very difficult position. He is not a vassal to Assyria like Israel and Syria are. They're paying tributes, all this wealth and all these people, right? But he knows one day they're going to come there. And then he finds that those two larger, more powerful northern neighbors, Syria and Israel, want to force him to join their coalition either through war or by assassinating him and putting someone on the throne who would join them. So he has some difficult choices. He can, first of all, choose to join Syria and Israel. He can say, I think the three of us together are powerful enough to defeat or withstand Assyria, so I'll join you, and let's hope that we beat them. Or he can join Assyria. He can say, I don't think that coalition would be powerful enough. I know I'm not powerful enough to resist these two kingdoms on my own, so I can ask Assyria for help. Now, if he does that, he's going to have to start paying tribute and all that kind of a thing, but he will at least not be invaded and destroyed by Syria and Israel. All right? Those are the two choices that he sees and that really the world would tell him exist. But Isaiah, on behalf of God, is going to give him a third option. And that third option will be, don't do anything, just trust in God and let him take care of it. Right? And I think that this is important. This is one of the major themes of Isaiah. Are you going to trust in the world or in God? And it starts out with this event that's early in Isaiah's life and early in his ministry. It's when he's barely married, just started having children, and that's typically very early 20s, so like the age of our missionaries or barely returned missionaries, that kind of a thing. And he sees this play out. He sees the choices that Ahaz has. He sees Ahaz make the wrong choice and how it doesn't work out well for him. And this will be a recurring theme in Isaiah's ministry, trusting God, not in the powers of the world. All right, so what happens is that Isaiah is told to come. Let's see if we can get our picture here. The city of David is right in this area, and he's going to come down to the lower part of that area where there's a waterway, and it comes out and waters fields, and God tells him that King Ahaz will be there, and he should bring his son, who is a prophecy, and talk to Ahaz there. So here you can see, looking from the other side, this area is the city of David, or Jerusalem at the time, and this is the valley, the Kidron Valley, where he's going to come. And here's a picture of the Gihon Spring. That's where the water is coming from, all right, as he comes out to meet him. So let's read some of this in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 3. Then said the Lord unto Isaiah, Go forth now to meet Ahaz, thou and Shear-Jashub thy son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool, on the highway of the fuller's field. So that's all those places I've just described to you. Now remember the choices that he's going to present to him here. So what's happened is that God has said through Isaiah to Ahaz, I know you've heard that those two kings are going to come to war against you and try and conquer you or assassinate you. And then this is what Isaiah says. Thus saith the Lord God, it shall not stand, neither shall it come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. And within 65 years, so that's 65 years, right, shall Ephraim be broken, that it be not a people. Now it's actually going to be even less than that. And the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son. If you will not believe, surely ye shall not be established. So this is where he tells him, don't worry about it. Let me take care of it. This isn't going to last. This kingdom that's oppressing you is going to be gone, but I'll still be here. All right, so that's what he tells him. Now, he then tells him to ask for a sign. Normally, as Latter-day Saints, we think a sign, Normally, as Latter-day Saints, we think a sign is not a good thing. But that's because we've been told by Christ and Joseph Smith, the people who seek for a sign are a wicked and adulterous generation. That seems to be the kind of sign where we say, I'm not going to believe unless you show me a sign. It's not the kind of sign that God offers to give you, or where you say, I'm following you, God, I just don't know what to do. If you want me to do this, then please have this happen, or if you want me to do this, please have this happen. At least in the scriptures, we see God working with those kinds of signs quite a bit. But in this case, Isaiah says, ask for a sign so that you can know that I'm serious, that God is going to take care of you. Now, Ahaz seems to have his mind made up. And he says, I don't want a sign because that's going to just cause trouble because I'm not going to listen anyway. So he speaks as if he really cares, and he says, oh, I don't want to tempt God. So in chapter 7, verse 12, Ahaz said, I will not ask, neither will I tempt the Lord. And then Isaiah, on behalf of God, says, Hear ye now, O house of David, is it a small thing for you to weary men, but will you weary my God also? So he's saying, look, I told you to ask for a sign. Don't play this coy game with me. And so I'm going to give you a sign, and here's the sign. Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Butter and honey shall he eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that thou abhorrest shall be forsaken of both her kings. Now that's an interesting sign. We're very familiar with this. We call it the Emmanuel prophecy. We're very familiar with this, but let's see. I think there's a lot more to it than we often think of. So let's see if we can kind of break this down a little bit, all right? So as we said, the sign is Emmanuel. God will be with us. Literally, Em is with, and Nu is us, and El is God. So with us is God, all right? But we have to ask, how is this a sign that this will happen, and when can it be fulfilled? So let's look at the whens, and I think we're going to see there's a lot more to this prophecy than we often think. The one we always think of is Christ, and that's absolutely true. He's the most important fulfillment of this, conceived of by a virgin, and literally God with us. That is the most important fulfillment. But we also need to look at the term that we translate as virgin. It's alma. There is a term that can only mean virgin. That's not the term that's used here. The word alma can mean virgin or just mean a young woman. It says young maiden, but actually it's a young woman. It doesn't have to be necessarily a virgin as in never having conceived a child. it means someone who's young. Okay, so let's now try and look at the when of this fulfillment. So remember, as we look here, that it says, before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good. So by the time the child is old enough to know the difference between good and evil, we would typically say when the child is about 8 years old, right? And so that should say that by the time, within 8 years, by the time the child that Isaiah is talking about is 8 years old, both of these lands will have lost their kings and will have been conquered, all right? Now, this prophecy is given about 735 BC. Ahaz starts his reign around that year, all right? Christ is born about 4 BC. This is 730 years later. How is that a sign? How is that fulfilling the sign, right? So I think Christ is, but he can't be the only fulfillment of this sign, all right? So let's look for some other clues. If we go to chapter 8, we see this. Moreover, the Lord said unto me, take thee a great roll, and write in it with a man's pen concerning Maher-shalal-Hash-baz. So we should know that the names of these children are prophecies, just like with Hosea. Shir-Jashub says, a remnant will return. All right, so that's a prophecy that even though Israel is going to be scattered and Judah will be scattered, a remnant will return. Maher-shalal-Hash-baz is hasten to the spoil, make quick the prey, and so on. It's about destruction is coming. So he says, and I took unto me a faithful witness to record Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Berechiah. And I went unto the prophetess. So let's keep in mind, he has a very young wife. She could be described as an Alma. And I went into the prophetess, and she conceived and bare a son. Then said the Lord to me, call his name Maher-shalal-Hash-baz. Now look at why. For behold, the child shall have knowledge to cry my father and my mother, or before the child shall have knowledge to cry my father and my mother, the riches of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria shall be taken away before the king of Assyria. So it's the same sign. Those two kingdoms will be destroyed and the kings will be taken away. This time, the timeline is a little bit different, all right? So we know that it's the same prophecy. They're going to be gone, but when? Well, before the child shall cry my father or my mother. This is usually around the age of 2, right? Is when they can start to say mommy and daddy, somewhere in those. So it's a little bit of a different timeline. So is one of the fulfillments Maher-shalal-Hash-baz? I think it's very clearly so. It says, if we look at this verse, right, it's the same sign. Before the child is a certain age, the same thing is going to happen. So Maher-shalal-Hash-baz is one of the fulfillments with a slightly different timeline than what we've seen before. So let's, again, think of this idea that a virgin shall conceive and see what Elder Holland has to say, just so that, you know, I didn't make this up on my own. I mean, I certainly see it and saw it, but so have lots of other people. Elder Holland says, the dual or parallel fulfillment of this prophecy comes in the realization that Isaiah's wife, a pure and good young woman, symbolically representing another pure young woman, did bring forth a son. This boy's birth was a type and shadow of the greater and later fulfillment of that prophecy, the virgin birth of the Lord Jesus Christ. The dual fulfillment here is particularly interesting in light of the fact that Isaiah's wife apparently was of royal blood and therefore her son was of the royal line of David. Isaiah's son is thus the type, the prefiguring of the greater Emmanuel, Jesus Christ, the ultimate king who would be born of a literal virgin. So we have to ask ourselves, how is Maher-shalal-Hash-baz's birth a sign that God is with them? Emmanuel. Well, I would say that if they see that those kings are taken away and that oppression is relieved, it's pretty clear God is with them. But I would suggest that this is not the only fulfillment, and we have to look at this discrepancy in age, right? So remember, we have one is before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, those kings are going to be gone. And in the other, it's before he's old enough to cry mommy and daddy. I would suggest that another, and this has been how Jews for millennia and others have taken the fulfillment to be King Hezekiah, all right? So Hezekiah is born around 740 BC. That means he's about 5 years old at the time of the Emmanuel prophecy. So if we were to then look at 5 plus 3, and let's look at Maher-shalal-Hash-baz, if he is conceived just after that, and then you've got about 2 years later he's speaking, roughly 3 years later is when this is going to happen. If Hezekiah is about 5, 3 years later he's about 8, you see how the timelines line up. And so within about 3 years from when the prophecy is given, when Hezekiah is about 8 and Maher-shalal-hash-baz is about 3, those 2 kings are going to be taken away. All right? So how might Hezekiah be Emmanuel, or a sign that God is with us? Well, not only will we see that those 2 kingdoms are taken away in about 3 years, but later in Hezekiah's life, and this will be a big part of the lesson for next time, but later in Hezekiah's life, Hezekiah will get Israel to get rid of their idolatry, unite in righteousness, keep and renew the covenant, and then trust in God, and God will deliver them from an enemy they can't deliver themselves. Now, that's a clear sign that God is with them. But also, it should help us understand Christ better. Let me say again, Hezekiah is a fulfillment. He gets his people to forsake their sins or their idolatry, follow God, unite with each other in renewing the covenant, and then God saves them from something they cannot save themselves. By understanding what Hezekiah does as a fulfillment of this, it helps me understand all the better Christ as a fulfillment of this prophecy, right? And we also understand the history better from what's going on. Okay, because of Pekah and the Syro-Ephraimite war, we have Syria and Israel attacking Judah, as I said, and many were taken away and some were returned, so we've talked about all of that. But as a result, because Ahaz had asked Assyria for help rather than trusting in God, he doesn't listen to Isaiah. And he doesn't just say, I'll do nothing and let God deliver us. He goes to Assyria. Assyria does relieve them, but then Assyria will take control of Judah. They're going to let Judah remain their own kingdom, but now they have to start paying all of this tribute and so on. They lose because they didn't trust in God. It doesn't work out for them. That's important to understand, all right? Now, what happens is then, this is in 732 BC. So remember, we had about 735 the prophecy being given, and in 732 BC, Assyria comes down to Syria and defeats them and takes a whole bunch of their people back to Assyria. And then they go down to Israel, and they defeat Israel and take a whole bunch of Israelites back to Assyria. This is the beginning of the scattering of Israel, and you can see how it happens in exactly that timeline that we've been talking about, the one that Isaiah gave them. And so we get Israel being the scattering of Israel beginning as they take a whole bunch of them back to Assyria, and from there they will disseminate. But that's not the end of the story. We've covered a lot. We have just a little bit more to do here. Hosea, the king, will, Tiglath-Pileser reports that he's the one who puts him on the throne in Israel. When he comes down in 732 and conquers, he says he's the one who puts Hosea on the throne in Israel. Judah becomes an Assyrian satellite, as we said, and they all are sending huge tributes to Israel, and to Assyria. And Israel really is very, very strongly controlled by Assyria at this time. Shalmaneser V will succeed Tiglath-Pileser, and he comes against Israel because they withheld tribute during the transition. Everyone does that. They think, oh, maybe this king won't be powerful enough. And they withhold tribute, and he comes down and he just pays them tribute before they can even have a battle. But then Hosea allies with Egypt. So you can see they keep paying and then saying, this is too much. We can't keep coming up with all this wealth and sending all of our children to Assyria. So you'll pay for a while, and then you just say it's too much, we can't do it anymore. So he allies himself with Egypt, who again promises they'll help, and he stops sending tribute. Shalmaneser moves in, and he shuts Hosea up in prison, and he's able to get Hosea out of there, and he shuts him up in prison, and he lays siege to Samaria for 3 years. All right, it's a long siege. Samaria is strong enough that they can't take it immediately, so it's a 3-year siege. People are starving. Terrible things are happening. He finally takes Samaria, but just after he takes Samaria, he dies. And so his successor, Sargon II, has to go. He was there in the battle, but he has to run home, make sure he consolidates power, get enthroned as king and so on, and then he will come back and reconquer Samaria. So the Samaria thought, oh, we've been delivered. But no, he comes back and reconquers Samaria. Egypt sends some people to help, but they're not very helpful. He defeats Egypt and everyone else, and he deports Israelites, all right? This is what Sargon II says about it. We have this from his own record. I besieged and conquered Samaria. I led away booty, 27,290 inhabitants of it. I formed from among them a contingent of 50 chariots and made the remaining inhabitants assume their positions. I installed over them an officer of mine and imposed upon them the tribute of the former king. So they're going to have to pay that same tribute, but they have no more king. He took away 27,000 people just from the city of Samaria. He's going to take away more from everyone. So you remember we've had this map where in 732 they came down and conquered and took a lot more people. Well, this is now 721, and he comes down and he takes away a whole lot of people. Not everyone, but he empties out a lot of the countryside and the villages and deports them back to Assyria, where they will stay for a time, and then eventually they will move all over the place. And this is what we call the scattering of Israel. We're going to come back to that concept in just a moment. It's really, really important to understand, but this is how the scattering of Israel happens, okay? This is also when Samaria, not the capital, but kind of the province of Samaria is established. Because what happens is the Assyrian emperor takes people who'd rebelled elsewhere in his empire and moves them into that Israelite countryside. So now you have the poor, it's really just the poorer group that's left in Israel, and then you have foreigners who move in, and they start to intermarry, but the foreigners say, we're getting eaten by lions and all sorts of terrible things are happening because we don't know how to worship the God of this area. And so they're taught how to worship Jehovah, but it ends up being this kind of interesting hybrid, both in terms of people. They're part Israelite, part people from all over the Assyrian Empire, and their worship will be largely Israelite, but also mixed in with other people, the worship of other people. And this becomes it's called Samaria after the capital, and they're called Samaritans after that capital. This is the establishment of when we get the Samaritans, and we're going to see that story of the Samaritans play out elsewhere in the Old Testament and the New Testament. All right, this is when we get the Samaritans being established. Okay, now let's go back to this idea of the scattering of Israel that happens. So this is the blue line represents the people coming in from elsewhere in the empire. Okay, so let's ask this question: why did they fall, and why were they scattered? And we're told very clearly in 2 Kings chapter 17. So what I'd like you to do is pause the video for a minute and read 2 Kings 17 and make a list what you see why God says they are being scattered. Okay, hopefully you've looked and you've seen some things, and we can learn some lessons from it, all right? So let's look at what 2 Kings chapter 17 tells us. It tells us they didn't keep the Lord's laws. They built high places, meaning places to worship other gods. They built groves where they would have immoral rites to other gods. They served idols. They ignored the warnings of the prophets. They rejected God's statutes and judgments, so that's like saying they didn't keep the laws. And they followed after vanity or things that didn't last very long, that were fleeting. They made molten calves and also molten idols and so on, and they caused their sons and daughters to pass through fires and used divination. They tried to find out things not through God's way, but through their own ways, all right? Now, we're going to come back to this list, but I want us to read this before we come back to this list. President Kimball says this: idolatry is among the most serious of sins. Modern idols or false gods can take such forms as clothes, homes, businesses, machines, automobiles, pleasure boats, and numerous other material deflectors from the path to godhood. Intangible things make just as ready gods. Degrees and letters and titles can become idols. Many worship the hunt, the fishing trip, the vacation, the weekend picnics and outings. Others have as their idols the games of sport, baseball, football, the bullfight, or golf. So we call it football sometimes. Still another image men worship is that of power and prestige. These gods of power, wealth, and influence are most demanding and are quite as real as the golden calves of the children of Israel in the wilderness. So let's go back to this list. This is why Israel fell. But let's ask ourselves honestly, is this me in some way? Am I choosing to, none of us are perfectly obedient. Let's be clear about that. We can't be perfectly obedient, and we can't rely on that or give into that. But we also shouldn't be saying, well, I like these kinds of laws and not other kinds of laws. High places and groves, especially those groves with the immorality and rituals associated with that. President Nelson might call this the pleasures of the flesh. Remember what President Nelson tells us that the world teaches us will bring us pleasure and peace and rest and joy. He tells us that the world is teaching us that power, possessions, popularity, and pleasures of the flesh will give us what we are looking for. And then he goes on to assure us they cannot. They cannot give us peace and joy. We think they will because the world teaches us that, but they cannot do it. And see how those are, and here, the idea of groves, that's the pleasures of the flesh. And the idols are in some ways possessions and popularity. It's these same things. Look at this list and ask yourself what idols, these kinds of idols that President Nelson and President Kimball talk about, how are they in our life? Because what we don't want is to be falling and scattered, right? Destroyed and scattered. Now, this is something we mentioned earlier, but we need to think about it seriously. Look at this list of kings, and I just went through in categories according to whether the text said they did right in the sight of the Lord or not. And you will see a stark difference between the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel. There are a number of kings of Judah who did right in the sight of the Lord, and there were none. Now, I think there were some who were fairly righteous, but because they never got, I've got Jehu with an asterisk there because he did some things. I'd say you could probably put Jeroboam the second in there. But they largely followed the Lord, but not fully in terms of idolatry. And as a result, Israel became wicked more quickly and was destroyed and scattered more quickly. It's striking how much the leaders affected them. So again, I would plead with you, think about the thought leaders you have chosen to follow. And only follow righteousness. Get rid of the stuff in your life, whether that come from Hollywood or the music you listen to or the podcast you listen to or the entertainment, whatever your entertainment, whatever it is that is influencing your thoughts, get rid of that which is not godly. Quit letting it influence you because these leaders influence us more than we think and they take us to destruction and being scattered from God. And we do not want to be scattered from God. Now, let's look at one last thing as we end this lesson. We've witnessed the scattering of those 10 tribes. How did they get lost? It's not that they didn't know geographically where they were. We can trace them for quite a while, a few generations through various names and things like that. We know where they were, and they weren't that far away, and they knew how to get back. And when Assyria fell to Babylon, they could have come back. But by that point, they'd lost track of who they were. The problem with the northern kingdom was always that they were so taken in by what everyone around them was doing. The fact that they were all doing idolatry made the Israelites feel like they should. This is why we get Jezebel and others that influence them so much. They see, you remember when we have kings that go and visit, we didn't even go through this, but we had kings that went and visited the Assyrians and brought back their idolatry with them. They are always so taken in by the prestige and the popularity of doing what everyone else is doing, that when they were moved somewhere else, they just assimilated. They loved the culture and the ideas of the world around them so much, they forgot about being an Israelite, and they became whoever they were living with. So it's not that they got lost geographically, it's that they lost their covenant identity. That's how they became the lost tribes of Israel. And that's a danger for us as well. The pressures of the world around us are immense. And it's easy for us to be taken in by them and to just want to be like others and to not have people look at us strangely because we have different ideas of morality and marriage and family and all sorts of other things than they do, of integrity and honesty. It's easy for us to get lost in that way and to lose our covenant identity. But if there's a lesson we should learn from this, it's twofold. One, it's easy for us to get lost if we aren't focusing solely on God and letting God prevail most in our lives. And two, when we do get lost that way, God will always work with us. He will humble us and bring us back to Him. Because of His chesed, He will always give us another chance. He will never stop working to bring us home, and it's possible to come back to Him because of His Son, Jesus Christ. And of this I testify in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.